Still ahead, a new solution to Toronto's housing crisis, co-op homes making a comeback.
We're at 15.5 million people, going to 20 million pretty quickly, and we need all kinds of housing. And the cooperative model, the cooperative component, is an important part of that strategy. It needs to grow.
All right, so we explore the history behind those co-op units and what role they could play in solving our housing problem. Talia Ricci has that deep
Maybe
dive
you should get into
coming
why
your way
there
next.
isn't so many co-ops anymore. You know, instead of saying like, oh, let's go into the history, maybe you should explain why there isn't any co-ops, at least in Ontario. Plenty of co-ops here in Quebec.
The law still requires
Yeah, and it was
it
also
for
just there
all
was no
patients.
incentive because they
Now
weren't
the
protected,
orders want to
right?
change that.
There's always a dose that we receive when you do an exam.
Like with basic co-ops, you know, you have zoning protection so that they're sustainable and that, you know, the land doesn't just go to the highest bidder, right? That's government has the capacity to do that. That's what we've done for a very long time. But we remove that, you know, that restriction on zoning where it's like, okay, we need X amount of co-ops in so many different neighborhoods. They get rid of that, so then it just becomes, you know, for-profit housing. Individualized for-profit housing too, right? And that's why like the only places that you go in like, you know, in Toronto, there's no new co-ops. They don't exist. It's just not a thing because it's not a sustainable thing. Only now, right? Like I'll go back to that one. You know, and it's not just the conservatives, right? Like the liberals do the thing where when it's the good times and things are booming, they remove regulations, right? Because it's like, well, who needs a co-op when everybody's got good housing, right? And so then the government regulations that are meant to, you know, make co-op housing sustainable are removed the next time that they're needed, right? So like from the mid 90s through to the 2000s, while the liberals were in power, there was this, you know, profitization of housing, which of course accelerated once Ford got into power, but it would be completely ignorant to say that it was just Ford. You know, and even the NDP is complicit too, because they're, yes, the ratchet effect, exactly. But in the, the NDP is complicit in it as well.
Turning now to spotlight one solution to Toronto's housing concerns.
Here we go.
The city is making moves towards building one of the largest affordable housing projects in decades. The mega project will include hundreds of co-op units, and it's actually the first time in years that many co-op homes are being built in our city. Talia Ricci has more on their comeback.
The co-op
Probably
has
in the
opened
province.
its doors to everyone. Canada's first co-op apartment building.
Because managing a co-op means new responsibilities.
Today, the co-op buildings you see around the city are like relics of a bygone era, both when it comes to the architecture and also the cost of living in one.
Bang.
This nonprofit co-op in
That's the only
Riverdale
one I
is
can think
likely
of,
one
is
of
the
the
Bang
oldest in the
co-op.
province. A one-bedroom here goes for, get this, $1,100, and a four-bedroom, $1,800.
That's more money than what I pay here
To give
in
you a bit of
Montreal.
context, the average one-bedroom in Toronto right now is around $2,500. Needless to say, the people who live here love it.
This would be considered one of the bigger kitchens. Some of
It's the
them just
lowest
have
market
literally
rate you
a
can get
strip
in Toronto.
of a galley
And it's
kitchen. As
$50
John says, there's
more than what
balconies
I
in all
pay
the
in
units, which I
Montreal.
didn't know. I assume most of them. We went and saw 5 other units today.
And you'd
Each
have
one
to
would
wait
be
probably
completely different than the other. All
15
have pretty
years
small
to be able to get a
bathrooms.
place there.
These places are
And
homes,
it's like
the whole
feudalism. They're
breadth
literally
of
like
life
put
happens
part,
within them
like
and spills
handed
outdoors,
down to families.
because we have these big
Like
courtyards,
one
and
from
sometimes
one
it can
generation
be
to the
noisy,
next.
and you're not in the mood for noise. But overall, we
It's
cohabit
beautiful. It's
pretty darn well.
And you also
It's
probably won't be surprised
amazing.
to
It's
hear
an
that for the
amazing
lucky
place.
few who lock
But
down a
there's one of
co-op
them.
unit over the
Here in
years,
the
they
city that
tend
I
to
live,
stick around.
I can
As
think
long
of
as
like
you're paying the
3
monthly
that are near
charges
me.
and abiding by the rules, you are welcome to stay as long as you want. Anyone can apply, but lists to get into these buildings are years long, and members'
How
families
long?
sometimes get priority.
I moved here when my son was 2, and he's now 35. And my daughter just moved here in December, and so I have grandkids here now too.
I've lived here for 40 years. Maybe, yeah, I moved in the mid-'80s. I'm particularly attracted to the self-management.
And it's all the most privileged people, right? Like it might be lower class people, but it's the most privileged of the lower class. So, you know, you end up creating like this, almost this aristocracy where they're all holding on to these co-ops.
A co-op is. First, we should differentiate between a nonprofit and an equity co-op. Those are the ones you see listed for sale. You buy a share of the building, which is your unit, and you need the approval of the board to move in. But the type of co-ops we're talking about today are registered as not-for-profit corporations. This is over 90% of existing co-op housing stock in Canada. Members jointly own and manage the building they live in. The monthly housing charges are designed to cover expenses with surpluses reinvested into the co-op. The members do not build equity in their housing. If they move, their home is offered to another household.
Everyone who lives in a co-op decides, what the policies are, what the budgets are, the monthly housing charges, approval of certain capital expenses, repairs, some of the community programs that they put on. It's all a joint model that every member of a co-op contributes.
Most co-ops were created between the 70s and the 90s. So what happened between the 90s and today? Basically, money from the government to operate these buildings slowed down. Then the housing market exploded and the population grew.
Yeah,
and
they
now here we are in a
extracted
housing crisis due to a lack of
They
supply.
incentivized privatizing
And co-op
the
buildings
market.
are
That's what's
back on
happening.
the government's radar.
They took money
we talked
away
to
from
Ontario's
co-ops
Associate
so that it
Minister
put
of
a
Housing
demand on the
about this.
housing
Why
to make
we're
it so
hearing
that
about it
people
now
who owned
is
housing
we're
could
at
make more
15
money
and a
off
half
of it.
million people going to 20 million
It was
pretty
a
quickly,
scam.
and we
It was
need
a
all
scheme.
kinds of
It was
housing.
an extraction
And the cooperative
of the
model,
middle
the
class.
cooperative component, is an important
Because that's
part
the only
of
method that they have to
strategy.
make
It
money
needs
is
to
to
grow.
invest in
The
speculative
province recently
real
announced
estate.
additional funding to support current co-ops and
So
build
when
new
you're
ones as part of its
control
investment
the
into
market,
housing.
Well, let me
you're
give you an
able to
example about the Kennedy
fix
site.
the prices.
So we removed development
to
fees,
basically
right?
time the
For
extraction.
purpose-built rentals, which the cooperative model falls under. So that alone saves that site approximately $1.5 million of fees they would have had to pay before that housing initiative. As well, we removed the HST, the provincial portion.
This is the site he's talking about. It's currently a commuter parking lot. It's not much to look at yet, but it's going to be
half of
a
them are
pretty
landlords,
exciting and substantial
You don't even need
project
to
in
lobby them.
Scarborough.
They're-
And that's what really has people talking about
Right?
co-op housing making a comeback.
And this is the first
How many
co-op
city
we've
councillors
seen,
of every major
kinda
city
come
in this
forward
country are also
for
landlords?
around a
I bet you
generation,
more than 50%.
and it's on the back of the city's land. So this is city land that we invited partners to kind of tell us what they thought they could do with it. And what we're seeing is this great kind of mixed-use project. It's got community space, it's got retail, it's right next to a transit hub, and it's got both market ownership, but importantly for us, over 600 new co-op homes.
Abby Bond says the city hears a lot of feedback from the community about wanting more co-op housing. And it's a form of housing that's been proven to be successful. People are happy, they can live comfortably and work in their communities. So the fact that this is actually now happening is a big deal and could serve as a blueprint for more projects like this.
People seem really drawn to the idea, and I think it really gives people a greater sense of community.
It's just so absurd because we literally tore some of these buildings down 25 years ago. Those same buildings in the city that I live are still standing, and they're thriving, and rents are cheap because we're not tearing buildings down to build new ones to make money off of, right? Like they're talking about rebuilding buildings that they took down 25 years ago. Maybe don't take them down.
It's a really kind of grassroots engagement in terms of living situations, which is really, really energizing and positive for, people living here.
It's this classic thing where they're taking an idea from 60 years ago and presenting it as if it's a new solution to a new problem, when it's like this would never have happened if you just stuck to the old way of doing things, the fair and honest way of doing things. And so they present this co-op as if it's some, incredibly groundbreaking idea, where it's like, no, this is basic human, like, function of government, basic civic operations of housing in a city.
Really depend on support from all levels of government and developers to make it happen. Talia Ricci, CBC News, Toronto.